Welcome back to the UCL AI Society podcast, Reinforcement Talking. My name is Serene, and we're here today with an episode on AI ethics. With AI being increasingly prevalent in every aspect of our lives, we need to make sure that it remains ethical at every stage of development and deployment. The decisions made by AI can have significant consequences for individuals and society as a whole. And so today, in exploring the intersection between AI, ethics, and modern life, there are fundamental pillars that have to be taken into account, such as responsibility, transparency, fairness, and privacy. Today, we have special guest Marcus Grazette, policy lead at Holistic AI, to talk with us today about why we need AI ethics. So thank you for being on, Marcus. Could you just start with a little introduction about yourself and AI ethics?
Yeah, so I'll start by talking a bit about myself. So I am a policy person by background. So I was a law student a long time ago at Nottingham. I graduated with my LLB. And then I spent about a decade working in the civil service. So I was in central government working in a policy role. And during that time, I wasn't actually working very much with technology policy at all. So my role was much more about solving some of the big foreign policy questions that were facing the UK. I transitioned out of that in 2019 and I went to a technology company working on privacy issues. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about privacy and how privacy fits with the responsible AI piece a little bit later. But at that company, we were really focused on the sort of responsible data use. So how could large organizations that wanted to use data that they had for things like machine learning, how could they actually achieve that in a way that was respectful of individual rights, and in this case, privacy? So the company I was working with then was developing privacy-enhancing technologies, which we can also go into and explain what those are and how they work. And that gave me a real taste for technology policy and thinking through sort of responsibility in that area. So I moved after that to work for the Information Commissioner's Office, the UK's data protection regulator. And there I was working mostly on online advertising. So thinking about how the online ad industry does things like tracking people as they move from website to website, as they click on different ads and interact with content. And a lot of that poses some really big ethical questions for things like surveillance and the way that ad targeting can potentially manipulate people's behavior. So again, big hooks there for thinking about ethical use of technology. And now I'm at Holistic AI. So we at Holistic AI work a lot on the pillars that you just mentioned around fairness, bias, transparency, explainability. And I think we'll explore some of those in a little bit more detail.
That's great. Thank you. So let's actually start then with your past experience at the privacy company. How would you see ethics being integrated into privacy policy? And do you think that in your experience, it's been a conscious effort to integrate them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the 2010s, we were very much in a period of focusing on responsible data use. So that was when the GDPR came into force. So it was passed in 2016 and then came into force 2 years later in 2018. And around that time, a lot of organizations, particularly large organizations with access to sensitive data, so I'm thinking people like banks, financial institutions, the NHS, which was a client of the previous company that I was at, we're all thinking about how they could use that data most effectively. So to take the NHS example, the NHS is nearly unique in the world in that they have access to data across the UK population, often from the time someone's born right throughout their life. And that can be hugely valuable to researchers wanting to do things like develop vaccines, as we've just seen, or test new theories or hypotheses about sickness and health. And the NHS wants to be able to grant those researchers access to data, but at the same time protect the identity of individuals. So privacy-enhancing technologies really enable that by transforming data or masking it in ways that mean that researchers can use it, but with lower risk to the individuals whose data is actually being used. And I think that was one of the core tenets of the whole responsible data use idea. So the idea that you can still use data and still get value from it, but you're doing a lot to protect individuals.
Okay, it's interesting that you mentioned the GDPR, because I think there's been a lot of mirrors between that and the upcoming EU AI Act, as I'm sure you're familiar with, which is set to be released this summer and is the first set of, as we know, comprehensive AI regulation. With responsible data, do you think you see a lot of mirrors in the responsible AI movement now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, lots of commentators are saying that the EU AI Act is the GDPR of AI.
Right.
And there are lots of parallels between the two. I think a couple of the most important are that they're horizontal pieces of regulation. So just like the GDPR applies to any use of personal data anywhere in the economy, whether it's in a bank or in a hospital or in your local corner store, the EU AI Act will cover uses of AI. And that means that it's really broad and applies horizontally across the whole economy. And that could potentially be problematic because what regulators don't want to do is stifle innovation. So in the AI Act, like in the GDPR, there's a whole process built in for assessing risk. So people developing or using AI will have to do risk assessments. They'll have to think about the context in which a system is used, the types of decisions, the types of people that it could impact, and make a judgment about whether that's risky or not. And the way that the EU AI Act is structured, they've got several different levels of risk. So you can be low risk, you can be lower risk. I think there's a sort of naming thing where they don't go low, medium, high, but there's something else in the middle that I now can't recall. But then you can be high risk. And if you're in that high risk category, lots of different requirements will then apply to you. And the EU AI Act also specifies there's some uses of AI that carry what they call an unacceptable risk. So those are things like personal scoring by governments, so social scoring. And those things are essentially going to be banned in the EU.
And so for our listeners who aren't really familiar with the EU AI Act, are there ethical implications that are inbuilt into the classifications, or are they to be determined from the classifications?
So it's a little bit of a mixture of both. So one of the criteria that might make a system high risk is whether it has an impact on safety. And safety is one of the principles around responsible AI. So systems should be safe in the sense that they should perform as expected under sort of normal circumstances. And it's in some cases quite obvious to see how an AI system might have a safety impact. So if we think, for example, about autonomous cars, the systems that help a car decide when to accelerate and brake could have a big safety impact and cause accidents, which could harm people quite directly. I think there's a really interesting area around safety that links to things like content recommendation. So a lot of us use social media. We know that the content that we see on social media platforms is recommended to us by algorithms and AI systems. And there's a real question around how people can experience harm from content that's recommended to them online. So for example, if I see something that's distressing, or if I see content that is maybe unlawful, or that should have been moderated out, like things like hate speech, for example, like that can cause harm to people when they're interacting with that content. So I think safety is a really important one, not just from the kind of classic example of things that cause harm in the physical world, but I think there's a whole category of harm in the online world that we're only just starting to explore.
The part you brought up about content moderation, I think, is really interesting, and it's really topical right now as well. As we know, there's been a lot of lawsuits that have been brought against big tech, for example, in the United States, against Google, where they're actually accusing Google of being responsible for spreading terrorist misinformation, which then caused physical harm, as you're saying. Do you think that it's possible? Well, I guess my question is, do you think it actually is Google's fault? Like, did their algorithm learn the ethics by themselves, so to say? Or do you think there are other considerations we should take when we're thinking about, for example, content moderation and whether there should be hard boundaries in terms of ethics and the implications that this has on machine learning, for example?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. So I think there are lots of different ways to respond to that. So one of them is thinking about the systems themselves. So is your algorithm that is designed to identify hate speech, for example? Because often these social media platforms will have a whole series of different systems that are all working together. So when you post a piece of content, when someone posts a piece of content online, the first layer will often be checking whether that content hits any red flags. So is it hate speech? Is it an offensive image, for example? And that will often be driven by AI systems that are trying to recognize images. So, for instance, in the US, there's a known database of child sex abuse images, which is maintained by, I think, a government body. And the social media platforms have a responsibility to check images that are uploaded against that database to try and identify those harmful images. So there's a question about whether those algorithms work properly. So are they accurate? Do they accurately match images when they should? So there's some technical issues around, are they generating false positives, false negatives? Are they performing as they should in those circumstances? But then there are also much broader questions around, freedom of speech and fairness, and the extent to which we want the internet to be a place where people can say things that are not illegal but may still be harmful. The Google example, I think they were talking specifically about terrorist content, so you would be probably in the realm of illegal there. Mm-hmm. But there's a really interesting gray area, which is stuff which is legal but harmful. And in the UK, the Online Safety Bill is grappling with that a bit at the moment. So what I mean by legal but harmful, are things like extreme dieting. So if someone starts looking at healthy food on YouTube, and then they go down this rabbit hole of videos where they end up with some really extreme content that may be harmful to them, but is not necessarily illegal. So I think there's some gray areas, and that's when you need a mixture of technical solutions, so making sure that the systems are working from a technical perspective, but also thinking about the societal context, like what is it as a society that we think is the right thing? And then questions about whether the big internet platform companies should be the ones with the power to make those sorts of decisions.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think one thing that a lot of people have been wondering is when you're designing these sort of systems and you're creating these policies, and I'm sure you must have experienced them, like with your time at the ICO, a lot of people are wondering, do we actually need AI ethics experts? Or, should there be a philosophical understanding of, for example, utilitarianism? How do we weigh these non-quantifiable ethics with quantifiable machine learning algorithms, and then the weights and the biases that you get from these? So should you have AI experts then, or is being human and, having this inherent, it's bad or it's wrong, is that enough, basically?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the answer is probably having multidisciplinary teams that can work on AI systems. And that means a little bit of overlap between some of the technical engineering skill sets, who would be the people typically working on AI development, so people who are doing coding or data science or statistics. I think working very closely with people who understand societal context and impact, so lawyers, ethicists, anthropologists, and also bringing the group of people who will be impacted by a decision into the conversation somehow. So I know, for example, that there are initiatives where often NGOs are talking to people who are impacted by these algorithmic decisions. So, for example, if you are a public body and you're using a system to help you decide on things like benefits payments, maybe the recipients of those payments should be included in the conversation about how a system should work. So I think the first answer to getting some of those ethical questions out in the open is just having those multidisciplinary teams and bringing in the people who are actually going to be impacted by a system when it's deployed into the real world.
Yep. I think interdisciplinarity has been something that's been really big lately. A lot of people, I do an interdisciplinary degree, so I think it ties in really well. But what was interesting, I think, has been your progression so far. So you started with a law degree, as you said, and then you went into policy, and now you're working at an AI startup, still doing policy. But did you expect to find yourself in this field?
I didn't. I couldn't have predicted maybe 5 years ago that I'd be working at an AI startup now. I think that I was in 2019 when I decided to move out of central government. I was really just following my nose. I was looking for where are the interesting policy questions happening, where they're being discussed, what are the topics. And so although I did a law degree, I did a little bit of sciences at A-level. So I had a little bit of a sense of things like maths and statistics and physics and that kind of stuff. Very basic, obviously, at that level. But I thought that there was a real gap for people who could bridge that gap. So people who could actually understand the policy context and be literate enough in some of the more quantitative domains to actually have those conversations. So understanding, for example, when you look at a list of different metrics that you could calculate about a system, how that might play into a policy context. And there's some really interesting questions about this in the context of HR and recruitment that we're working on at Holistic at the moment, where the choice of metric means that you may have a law which is defined in terms of a specific metric, but doesn't actually catch the bias or discrimination that you're trying to stop because of the way the metric's constructed.
Do you think you could give an example of that?
Yeah, sure. So, for example, in computer science, there are different ways to define fairness. Okay. And you can write out equations in terms of probability, looking at fairness between different groups in a population. So if you had, for example, men and women in a population, you could, using probability, describe a system that was fair in terms of selecting an equal proportion of men and women, for instance. Now, that might be fair from a machine learning perspective, but when you put that into the context of the real world, what might happen is that an organization might get far more applications from one group than the other. So they're still hiring different numbers of people, although from a statistical perspective, their hiring process is going to be fair. And that's where you start to get into questions about responsibility and accountability and those bigger societal issues, because is it the company's fault if they advertise a job and far more people in one group than the other apply, and then they hire far more people in one group because they're sifting from that pool of applications? To what extent do we as a society want companies to be more proactive and to say, actually, we're going to actively promote this job in a community of people who would typically not apply for it, for example? And that's when the interdisciplinary working comes in, because it's not just about the computer scientists, but also about the social scientists who might say, okay, well, if you want more people from one group or another to apply, you might think about wording your application differently, for example. So all these things are connected.
That's so cool, actually. So I guess this might be a bit of an impossible question. It's which came first, the chicken or the egg? But do you think that we have to have these sort of examples before policy, or do you think policy needs to be created to regulate the examples first?
So I think that's a great question. I think there's two ways that you can change behavior of people in companies. I think one way is by passing laws. And typically the critique of lawmaking is that it's quite slow. I mean, we've seen some of the challenges with getting legislation through Parliament, with, the political challenges that brings up. The other way is through sort of social pressure. And for example, in a consumer context, you often see brands responding to what consumers want because people vote with their wallets, and they might decide to buy or to use the services of one company whose values they agree with and not another company, for example. So I think the market is also a really interesting way of changing behavior of people in firms. And if companies are committing publicly to these ethical standards, so saying, for example, we have a commitment to, say, diversity in our workforce, and we will operationalize that commitment in these ways, and then they're transparent about the ways that they're actually doing that. So transparent about where they're using algorithms in hiring, about how those algorithms perform, if there's evidence of bias in them, and what they're doing to correct that bias. I think that will potentially create more of a societal pressure on people, on candidates for employment who might want to proactively go to that company.
Do you think we're going to see a trend then of like ethics washing?
Really good question. I mean, the greenwashing at the moment is a really topical issue. So I think we could do. I think that's a risk. And I think the way to mitigate that risk is through transparency. So if a company is saying that they behave in a certain way, and they're not transparent about, saying, okay, well, these are the hiring systems we use, these are the algorithms involved, and here's a scorecard showing their performance against different protected characteristics, for example. That might be one way of saying, well, actually, you're not providing the information we need to be able to verify that you're performing or that you're meeting the commitment that you've set for yourself. And there's some interesting initiatives around this. So Google proposes, for example, model cards. I'm sure lots of other big tech companies do similar things, where they will publish information about the performance of their commercially available models. So you can look at the model card and see, how does this facial recognition system, for example, perform against faces that are darker or lighter skinned. And in some cases, you can actually upload some test data, so you could curate your own little data set and run it through the model and check its performance. And I think transparency initiatives like that, which allow anyone to verify that the thing performs as it says, I think will be really important to avoid some of the ethics washing risk.
So I guess the main thing that you're trying to get from that is that AI education surrounding the ethics and how companies should operate in this space is necessary. But then I know one thing that people have been talking about as well is AI colonialism. And so how are we making sure that we're instilling the right, if there are any right, ethical standards into our tech? What are your opinions on that?
Yeah, it's again a huge area of ethics within AI. And one of the challenges, I think, is that there is this inequality in access to the technology. So we can't talk about AI in a podcast without talking about ChatGPT and the large language models. So I'm going to do that. This is the bit where I talk about ChatGPT.
Our theme music is actually AI generated.
Oh, right.
It's
that's pretty cool.
generative AI for music.
But one of the examples that I've seen in this kind of equity context is around the large language models and the fact that some languages have a lot more availability of training data because there's a lot more written down in those languages online than there is in other languages. So English, for example, lots of the text on the internet is written in English. A lot of that text is scrapable and has been included in the large language model training data sets. There may be other languages out there which are much less well represented, and therefore large language models will perform less well. And so communities that use those languages will not be able to interact with a system that is either as good or interact with a system at all in their language. And that raises big questions around inequality of access. And there's another interesting angle which I found fascinating when I did a little bit of research on it, but it's thinking about things like the climate impact of training and deploying these models. So ChatGPT, there are some researchers who tried to quantify things like electricity consumption and the associated carbon emissions. They're quite large numbers.
Can imagine.
I can't recall exactly what they are, and I'm not going to quote them for fear of getting them wrong, but there is a climate impact to all of this as well. And again, it's one of those things where there are more privileged parts of the world that have access to these systems and choose how to deploy them, design them, train them, etc. And that has a knock-on effect on other parts of the world who are not involved in that conversation. So I think there's a really interesting question about not just who decides what the right thing for the system to do is, but who decides to build these systems at all.
And I guess who gets to use them then.
And who gets to use them and benefit from them, because there is an economic benefit that comes from using these systems. So if we think that the large language models or generative AI systems in general will boost productivity, like where do those productivity boosts happen, and who are the people that benefit from the economic wealth that flows from that?
And I think this is a really topical thing. I mean, we all know, obviously, ChatGPT is very, very recent. It was only released last November, but it's already made such waves, and it's facilitating what we now know as like an AI arms race, basically, with Microsoft bringing out their Bing and Google with Bard. Everybody's just trying to compete for who has the biggest language model. And I think one thing that a lot of people don't consider is the fact that, like, as you said, there are impacts of this, and there are ethical impacts, there are real world impacts. It's not just a matter of, who has the biggest model or, whose algorithm works the fastest. These servers for this are located somewhere, and they're releasing carbon emissions somewhere. And I think that is definitely something that has to be talked about more. I wanted to ask, though, how you then see all this new technology pushing and transforming what we know of the ethics space. Basically, do you think that the technology has impacted ethics in a way that is tangible to us right now, or is it all still very theoretical?
I think that one of the things about ethics is that they evolve over time in societal context. So if you go back 10 or 100 years, what would be seen as ethical and just quote unquote the right thing to do or the right way to behave will have changed dramatically. And I think that will continue to happen. My personal view is that the AI tools that we're able to access today are probably accelerating that because things are happening much more quickly.
Right.
And as you say, because of this arms race, maybe some of the questions around is it the right thing to train and release a large language model and give people public access, or anyone who wants to pay $20 a month to subscribe to have access to these models, is that the right thing to do? And I think the arms race context mean that companies are making these decisions. They're not a societal decision. We haven't all voted for the fact that a large language model should be released or that it should cost this much every month or whatever. They're companies, and often like private companies in a particular bit of the US run by a particular group of people. So, there's a very small group of people in those companies who are making these big decisions that impact huge numbers of people. And actually, I think that's one of the interesting things about AI. It can operate at this massive scale. So the impact of it can be multiplied across, much more quickly than was the case with previous kinds of technology. So I think that we will have to, as a society, have that conversation, probably more slowly than the technology is moving. So it will change. When ChatGPT and the other generative models first came out, there was a lot of outcry about how it would fit with plagiarism, for example. How would you, as a teacher, ensure that your students were actually doing the work that they should and not just copy-pasting answers from ChatGPT? And you've seen both a technical response to that, so people building tools that can detect text that's been written by a generative model, and also a societal response to that, people saying, hey, there might be legitimate ways to use these tools in the same way that you would use a search engine or go to your library and look at an encyclopedia a few years ago. There are ways that you can integrate these tools into your workflow that means that they can actually maybe help you boost your productivity, help you generate new ideas. So those conversations are starting to happen, and maybe we'll get to the point in a few months or years' time where there is consensus about what the right way, in inverted commas, to use tools like that is. But I think that will lag behind. I think it will come though.
Do you think that means that technology should slow down then? That it should wait for people to decide?
That's a great question. I think that the two things are interdependent. So if we didn't have the technology to do the things that we could do, there wouldn't necessarily be a reason to ask ourselves the ethical questions. So, interesting parallel from medical research. As medical technology improves, we can do things that we just weren't able to do before. Stem cell research, the types of surgery now that we have that we can preserve life, or the sorts of machines in intensive care units that can keep someone alive long after they would have passed away many years ago. So having the access to that technology has forced us to have the conversation about whether we should use it. So when is it appropriate to prolong someone's life on a life support machine, for example? And those ethical questions are prompted by the fact that we can do it. So we need to ask ourselves the questions. So I think the two are interconnected. And I wouldn't say that technology should slow down. I would probably say that we can use some of the technology to help have those conversations. Social media means we can talk to lots of people in a way that we couldn't do in the age of printed leaflets or printed books.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think because a lot of people are talking about it, but I feel like at the same time, nobody exactly knows the questions that they should be asking to really get to the root of this. Because again, where is the root? Where's the start and where's the end? I think it's so far into the future that we can't see, and it's impossible to predict, honestly, where it's all going to go. So I think the last question I have for you today is, what is the biggest question that you think has to be answered first?
The biggest question. So if we come right back to where we started about ethical frameworks, you mentioned utilitarianism. There are still lots of different ethical frameworks. And the underlying point is to try and have this rational way of deciding what the right thing to do is. And I think we're always searching for what that framework is, and people have their preferred flavors. Some people are utilitarians, other people focus on individualism or other types of ethics that you can imagine. So I don't think that we're ever going to answer the one question. I think asking the question about what the right way to approach something is probably all we can hope to do, and have those conversations, work in a multidisciplinary way to make sure that a diverse set of voices is actually contributing. And I think by doing that, we will hopefully avoid some of the big pitfalls that we've seen with other kinds of technology in the past.
All right. Thank you so much. It's been great having you on the podcast. And that is Reinforcement Talking by the UCL AI Society. Thank you, and tune in next time.